welcome back to Cosmic Play.
In this video, we're going to be showing you how we made Cloud's Buster Sword from Final Fantasy VII Remake that came out on the PlayStation 4 this year. If you want to see more cosplay videos just like this one, consider subscribing to this channel.
Dang.
So I started by trying to gather references for the sword and taking screenshots in the game. I found a fan-made model on Sketchfab, uploaded by a user called JMGameDev. There's a link in the description. But I decided to use this one for a reference as well because it seems pretty accurate to the game. I used the model to capture references up close, and I also took a screenshot of the 3D model. I used Photoshop to trace around it. Then I printed it over multiple sheets of paper using Rasterbator. And then I cut it out.
We wanted to try XPS foam for this project. We've never tried it before, so it was something new. The only thing is we could only find it in 2x2 sheets at Home Depot, so we decided to try to glue the 2x2 sheets together to see if we could get the length of the sword, but most of the glues that we tried kind of ate through the foam.
After researching online, I was lucky enough to find a local place that actually sold full 4x8 sheets of this foam. It's called Foam Sales Group. For some reason, I wasn't thinking when we headed over there and I drove my Civic. Luckily, once we got there, we were able to cut the sheets down a little bit and make them all fit. They also recommended a special kind of glue made just for this foam that seems to work pretty well to bond it. It seems pretty similar to school glue, so if you don't have access to it, school glue would probably work. We also found some marbles at the craft store that I thought looked a lot like Materia, but they only came in blue. After we gathered all of our materials, I decided to start by actually making the LED circuit that we were going to put behind the Materia. I tested a couple different colors of LEDs, and in the end I decided that the blue and green ones looked pretty good. A lot of times LEDs are the extra element that we add in our props and costumes to kind of try to elevate them to the next level. After I finished the circuit the first time, the green LEDs actually burnt out because I forgot to use a resistor, so I had to remake it. This one seems okay, but the green is still getting a little warm, so I don't know how it'll be after like a whole convention.
At this point, we used the pattern to cut the shape of the sword onto the new XPS sheet. Then I started beveling the sword by cutting the excess off. I made a guide throughout the sword to indicate where I should bevel and started cutting along the sword with a box cutter. My dad saw that I was hacking away at this thing for a while, so he basically helped me cut it in a short time. Once we were done beveling the sword, it was time to sand along the edge to make it smooth. The place where we bought the foam also recommended a coating to go on top of the sword. It's supposed to be lightweight and make the sword itself rigid, so we put a generous coat on top and let it dry.
While it was drying, we decided to start cutting the EVA foam that we were planning to glue along the front and back side of the blade in order to achieve that raised edge. I also decided to cut another scale pattern just so we had an extra one. We were planning to use the original to cut into smaller pieces, but I thought it would be handy to have an extra one to see how all of those pieces incorporated into the finished product.
After the coating was dried, we examined it and we saw that the coating itself was very similar to plaster. it was a little brittle for our taste, so we decided to go with a different coating. We decided to go with Epsilon Pro instead. We had to scrap this sword because of the brittle coating on top, but we used that same very sword to try out the Epsilon to make sure it didn't eat through the foam. We did have to cut a new base using the new piece of XPS foam. We glued the EVA foam onto the XPS using XPS glue. The glue itself takes a couple of hours to dry, so we just set some books on top to keep pressure on the sword to make sure it was nice and even. In the meantime, I used a reference to trace out the layered details that go on the hilt of the sword. I had to add some extra width to account for the wrapping of the details that went around the sword. By the end of the day, the glue had dried on one side enough for us to turn it around and repeat the same process on the other side. We glued the EVA sheet down and applied books again to keep the pressure on top. The next day, I cut the EVA foam details out that went on top of the sword, and also traced those details onto the sword itself to show where they would be placed.
Then I had to glue them into place. The first layer was kind of tricky because to glue the EVA foam to itself, I had to use barge, but to glue it to the XPS foam, I had to use the special XPS glue. Now, if I got any barge onto the XPS foam, it would actually melt the foam because there's so much solvent in it. I actually ended up getting just a teensy drop on the table and then onto the blade, and it caused a significant hole that we had to patch later.
There's a lot of things I thought of that I thought, oh, he's careful enough, he can do it. No. I continued to cut out EVA foam pieces and outlining them onto the sword where they had to be glued.
So I continued to glue the pieces into place, but sometimes I did struggle to align them precisely. And we ended up with some excess on the side.
I was able to cut out the excess foam and kind of smooth it out. I continued by cutting a box out where the LEDs were going to be housed. Then I cut some EVA foam pieces that were to go on top to cover the housing of the LEDs.
We decided to reinforce the panels by using a piece of acrylic that we actually had left over from when we built May's tank. I cut the acrylic to size and then glued the foam pieces on top. I cut holes in the foam where the materia slots would be. I glued one of the panels to the sword. Then I used a step drill to make the holes where the material would be mounted. Then I decided the best way to secure the marbles would be through UV resin. We knew we wanted to use a 1/2-inch PVC for the handle of the sword, so I cut a slit in the middle of the hilt in order to slide in the 1/2-inch PVC foam. And in order for me to get it inside the sword, I sharpened one end of the PVC pipe and burrowed through the XPS foam. At this point, the LED circuit actually broke again while we were trying to test it in the sword, so I had to solder it again.
Is this strong enough?
We actually decided to use a longer piece of PVC to try to reinforce it and make it a little bit sturdier. So I continued with the longer piece to try to bore out the hole we made in the sword, but I ended up going a little too hard and rupturing through the side.
I knew it would be simple to patch the hole later. But at this moment, I decided to cut out a little more space in the box to put the battery that was going to light up the LED.
Then I secured the LEDs into the pipe using some hot glue and some UV resin. Then I finally glued the handle into place inside the sword. While it was drying, I also decided to patch some areas using cosplay clay.
The panel that was supposed to go on and off didn't really close well because of the Materia marble, so we decided to use the belt sander in order to level out the panel in order to fit it correctly. In order to allow us to take the panel on and off, I decided to use magnets. I attached magnets to the sword and the panel, but because I've worked with these magnets before, I knew they were going to shatter as soon as they touched each other because they were very strong. So I covered both the sword and the panel in Thybra. I also used Thybra in some other areas to reinforce the handle. Yeah, it's okay. When I was done with that, I was ready to start working on the hilt of the sword. I started by cutting rectangles out of a foam floor mat. I glued them to a sheet of 1/4-inch foam for a little extra thickness. We glued the EVA foam with the XPS glue. We kind of reinforced it with some tape in order for it to not go anywhere. Okay, it's good. Shinra! For the raised detail, I used 2mm EVA foam and glued it around the edges. Then I used a pattern to determine where I was going to place the buttons, punctured a hole where it was supposed to be, and glued them into place. We tried a couple of different things to get the details in the handle of the sword. The best thing that we decided to do was make them out of EVA foam to get them as close as possible to the game. It was tricky to glue some of the final pieces, but after everything was done, I used the rotary sander to kind of smooth out any bumps and bubbles. I hand sanded the finer details by hand. Then we patched any areas that needed repair with cosplay clay.
After we were happy with all the details, we coated the entire sword in Epsilon Pro. We applied 3 coats to each side. After it was fully cured, we sprayed the entire thing in gray primer. The primer helped us to see any blemishes, bumps, or holes that we had to work on. We went to work sanding any lumps left in the Epsilon. Along with filling any holes with UV resin or Bondo. Then we sprayed it with primer and repeated the process. And we just kept repeating this process, trying to remove more and more lumps and trying to refine it as much as possible. I spent 10 hours sanding, and I thought it was fine after that.
I'm probably gonna pose like this.
I primed it again and I thought that it was acceptable, so I sprayed the colors. I sprayed it silver and I did the base coat. But after I did that, I realized that it still wasn't ready because the silver actually just brought out more flaws, so I had to go back and sand it again for 2 more days. After I finally got it to an acceptable level, it was time to do the base coat of paint again. I started by painting the entire thing silver, and then for the darker areas, I used an oil rub metallic color.
It's not perfect, which is what bothers me the most, but we lived and we learned, I made the leather straps using a salvage piece from an old couch that I had. I distressed the handle using sandpaper. I started the paint job by applying a gunmetal gray to the hilt. And then I did the weathered details with a little bit of black and brown. So with Cloud's sword, it kind of had to look weathered. In the game, there's a lot of scratches on it, and in order to imitate that, I dry brushed silver onto the edges in order for it to look scratched. I also created some scratches using a pick and actually trying to damage the sword along the edges. The paint job was pretty straightforward. There isn't much variation to the colors, so there wasn't much for me to do other than to weather and highlight and accentuate the details with silver. After that, all I had to do was seal the sword and it was complete.
on this sword was kind of a struggle for me because I felt like I just kept doing everything wrong. I had to resolder my LED circuit 3 times. My pattern was missing details. I kept damaging the sword, and I had to just keep sanding. But in the end, I feel like we kind of pulled it together, and I think it looks pretty good.
With this sword, we learned a lot. With the XPS foam and EVA foam together, we figured out that it doesn't always glue the way you want it to. You can create bubbles if you're not careful enough. Using the Epsilon to kind of seal and coat things, I think next time I would probably use more coats in order to have more room to sand and make things a little more perfect. I think overall I'm pretty impressed with the size of the sword and the lightweightness of it. I'm pretty happy with the learning experience. I can see myself working with XPS foam a lot more in the future. It was pretty fun to just see it all together, and I think just seeing Cloud Sword in real life is pretty cool.
If you liked this video, do us a big favor, drop us a like, subscribe to the channel, leave us a comment. We appreciate it.
See you on the next one. Thank you very much.
I like that. Can I put that one, please?
Yeah.
Okay.